Blake Lively did not lose her case. That's not what Judge Lyman actually ruled, even though that's exactly how it's being reported. Because while the court did dismiss most of her claims, the judge never decided whether her allegations were true or false. He avoided that question entirely and instead threw out the case on a legal technicality. And that distinction matters, because parts of the case are still alive, not the ones dominating headlines, but the ones that could still move forward, depending on what happens next. So what looks like a complete collapse of Blake Lively's case is actually something much narrower and a lot less final than people think. But this is where the ruling becomes more complicated, because even after removing the majority of Blake Lively's claims, Judge Lyman did not dismiss the entire case. He allowed specific parts of it to move forward, and those parts focus on retaliation, not whether the alleged behavior on set legally qualifies as harassment, but what happened after she raised concerns. According to the ruling, there is enough dispute around that issue that it can't be resolved by a judge alone. Instead, it may need to be decided by a jury. And that changes the trajectory of the case, because now the focus shifts away from what happened during filming and toward what actions may have followed behind the scenes. That includes allegations tied to public relations efforts, media narratives, and whether there was any coordinated attempt to influence how Blake Lively was perceived publicly. Entities connected to this part of the case include Wayfarer Studios, the production entity It Ends With Us Movie LLC, and external PR involvement such as TAG. The court did not conclude that retaliation occurred, but it did determine that there is enough disagreement between both sides, enough conflicting accounts, that the issue cannot be dismissed outright. And that's why these claims remain active. So while Justin Baldoni and several individual defendants were removed from liability in this phase, the broader case itself wasn't fully closed. It was narrowed, and narrowed cases don't always disappear. Sometimes they become more focused. And this is where the interpretation of the ruling starts to split. Because on one side, the outcome is being framed as a complete collapse of Blake Lively's case, a clear win for Justin Baldoni and the other defendants. But the structure of the ruling tells a more layered story. Judge Lyman didn't weigh in on whether Baldoni's conduct or the conduct of others involved in the production crossed the legal threshold for harassment. In several instances, he explicitly avoided making that determination. Instead, the court focused on whether the alleged conduct, even if taken at face value, met the legal definition required under the statutes she filed under. And in many cases, the answer was no, not because the events were proven false, but because they didn't meet the specific legal criteria tied to employment-based claims. For example, some of the incidents described, including on-set interactions during filming, were evaluated in the context of a scripted production environment. The court noted that actions between actors, especially within a scene, are not automatically interpreted as personal conduct outside that context. That distinction becomes critical, because it separates what may feel inappropriate on a personal level from what qualifies as legally actionable under workplace law. At the same time, the judge did acknowledge that certain claims, particularly those tied to how Blake Lively says she was treated after raising concerns, could be viewed differently. Not proven, but not dismissible either. And that's why those claims were left unresolved. So what you end up with is a ruling that removes legal pathways without fully resolving the underlying dispute, which means the narrative isn't actually settled. It's just been redirected. Another important shift in the ruling is who remains in the case and who doesn't. Because while Blake Lively's claims against Justin Baldoni were a central focus from the beginning, the court removed all individual liability tied to several key figures. That includes Baldoni himself, along with Jamie Heath and others connected to Wayfarer. The claims that remain are no longer centered on individual actions in the same way. Instead, they are tied primarily to entities, including It Ends With Us Movie LLC and Wayfarer Studios, and whether those entities can be held responsible under the narrower claims that survived. And that changes the structure of the case. Because legally, pursuing a company is very different from pursuing individuals. It shifts the focus towards systems, decisions, and coordinated actions, rather than personal conduct alone. At the same time, one part of the case involving TAG, a public relations group linked to some of the alleged media activity, was not fully resolved. The court left open the possibility for further legal arguments on whether their involvement rises to the level of aiding or abetting retaliation. So even within what remains, there are still moving parts, dead ends in some areas, but open questions in others. And that's what makes the outcome less final than it appears. Because instead of a single clear conclusion, the ruling breaks the case into separate tracks, some closed, some still active, and some that could change depending on what happens next. So the question now becomes, what does this actually lead to? Because once a case is narrowed like this, it can go in a few very different directions. One possibility is that it never reaches trial. With most of the original claims removed, the remaining issues, mainly retaliation and contract-related disputes, may not carry the same weight or financial impact that the broader case once did. That creates pressure on both sides. For Blake Lively, continuing forward would mean focusing on a much smaller set of claims, with a legal framework that's already been significantly limited by the court. For Wayfarer Studios and the production entity behind It Ends With Us, the strategy may shift toward resolving what's left before it reaches a jury, especially if they believe the remaining claims can still be challenged or reduced further. At the same time, if the case does move forward, the focus changes entirely. It would no longer be about whether the original allegations meet the threshold for workplace harassment under laws like Title VII. Instead, it would center on whether actions taken after those allegations, including communications, media activity, or internal decisions, could be interpreted as retaliation. And those cases tend to rely heavily on interpretation, not just what happened, but how those actions are understood, and whether they can be directly connected to protected activity, which means credibility, documentation, and conflicting narratives become central. So even though the scope of the case has been reduced, the uncertainty hasn't disappeared. It's just shifted from broad claims with legal limitations to narrower claims that may depend much more on how a jury views the evidence, if it gets that far. And this is where the gap between perception and reality becomes the most visible. Because the way this ruling is being discussed publicly, especially across media and commentary, treats it like a final verdict, a clear outcome, a closed chapter. But legally, that's not what this is. What Judge Lyman issued here is a partial dismissal, one that removes specific legal pathways but doesn't resolve every issue connected to the case. And that distinction often gets lost. Because dismissed sounds definitive. It suggests that the claims were tested and rejected on their merits. But in this situation, much of the dismissal came down to how the claims were structured, particularly the employment classification that limited which laws could apply. At the same time, the remaining claims weren't validated either. The court didn't conclude that retaliation occurred. It only determined that those claims couldn't be dismissed at this stage, given the level of dispute between both sides. So both things are true at once. Most of the case is gone, but the case itself is not fully resolved. And that's why the outcome sits in a middle ground, one that doesn't fit cleanly into a simple win or loss. So when you step back and look at the full picture, This ruling does two things at the same time. It removes the majority of Blake Lively's case, including the claims that drew the most attention. But it also leaves a smaller, more focused version of that case still in play. Justin Baldoni and several individuals are no longer part of it. The legal path for those claims is effectively closed, but the broader situation hasn't fully disappeared. What remains now is a narrower dispute, one that could still develop, depending on how the remaining claims are handled moving forward. And that's the part that tends to get lost in the headlines. Because legal outcomes don't always come in clear, final answers. Sometimes they reshape the case instead of ending it. And that's what happened here. So rather than a simple win or loss, this is a shift, one that changes what the case is about and where it could go next. If you've been following this closely, the next phase will likely matter more than this moment, because that's where the remaining questions actually get addressed. If you want breakdowns like this, where we go past the headlines and look at what's actually happening, make sure you're subscribed. And if you have a different take on how this ruling should be interpreted or where you think this goes next, drop it in the comments. I'm curious how you see it. To understand what actually happened here, you have to look at how Judge Lyman structured his decision, because he didn't go through the allegations one by one and decide whether Justin Baldoni or anyone else did what Blake Lively claimed. Instead, he focused on a threshold issue first, whether Blake Lively even had the legal standing to bring those claims in the first place. And that came down to one question: was she an employee or an independent contractor? According to the ruling, she was not an employee. The judge described her as a highly skilled actor who negotiated significant control over the project, including input on the script, involvement in hiring decisions, influence over production elements, and even the ability to walk away from the film under certain conditions. That level of control, in the court's view, placed her outside the category of someone protected under employment laws like Title VII. And that's the key detail, because the sexual harassment claims weren't dismissed after being tested for truth. They were dismissed because, legally, she wasn't in a position to bring them under those laws at all. So instead of ruling on whether anything inappropriate happened on set involving Justin Baldoni or others like Jamie Heath or Wayfarer Studios, the court sidestepped that entirely. And that's why the outcome looks definitive on the surface, but is actually built on a very specific legal foundation.